Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
Coming home from work in the evening, the woman saw her husband and mother-in-law showing her premarital apartment to a potential buyer. They thought she was completely clueless, but they didn't know she could also deliver a good smack. Jamina Leal was born in a small town 300 kilometers from the capital, into a family of school teachers. Her father taught physics, and her mother taught literature. They lived modestly but with dignity. The family didn't have much in terms of material wealth, but books, education, and spiritual values always came first. Her parents instilled in her a love of learning, neatness, and the ability to find contentment in simple things. Jamina's early years were filled with books, long evening conversations in the kitchen, and yearly trips to the sea, trips her parents saved up for all year long. Jamina had a particularly warm relationship with her father. Raphael Leal, a lean but sturdy man with an attentive gaze, was a man of few words, but he knew how to listen. He taught his daughter to analyze situations, to take her time with conclusions, and to always seek out cause and effect. Jamina, life is like physics, he would say, stirring tea in a glass held by an old metal holder. For every action, there is a reaction. The key is calculating the force and direction correctly. Her mother, Sylvia Leal, was the opposite, more emotional and outgoing. From her, Jamina inherited a love for the arts, a passion for reading, and an ability to empathize. Her mother often took her to school literary evenings, where Jamina soon became the star poetry reciter. However, her parents weren't without flaws. Frequent arguments between them, sometimes stretching into days of silence, planted in Jamina's subconscious a view of family life as a constant battle to protect one's boundaries. Her father would occasionally yield to her mother in small matters, but when it came to core values, he was unshakably firm. Her mother, meanwhile, had a gift for getting what she wanted through emotional pressure. "You don't have to agree right away," Sylvia would tell her daughter, "but you must learn to stand your ground, especially with men. They're like children, they'll resist at first, but eventually, they'll just accept it." A turning point in Jamina's personal development came in 9th grade. A new geography teacher arrived at their school, a young, vibrant woman from a neighboring town. She started a geography club, where she talked not just about countries and continents, but also about solo travel, the importance of believing in yourself, and the courage to explore the unknown. "I've traveled halfway around the world with just a backpack and never let anyone treat me like I was helpless just because I'm a woman," she would tell her students. These stories left a deep impression on Jamina. She began to dream of travel, independence, and self-reliance. That same year, she made a firm decision. She would apply to a university in the capital and build her life in such a way that she wouldn't depend on anyone. Studying came easily to Jamina. She enjoyed the exact sciences, especially math, but she also wrote decent essays. She graduated with a silver medal, missing the gold only because of AB in chemistry. But that didn't upset her. Jamina never aimed to be perfect in everything. She knew how to prioritize. Getting accepted into the State University's economics faculty was her first real challenge and her first major victory. The competition was fierce, but Jamina got in and even secured a tuition-free spot. When she called her parents with the news, it was the first time she had ever seen her father cry. Her university years in the capital became not only a time of professional training but also of personal growth. Being alone in a big city overwhelmed her at first. The dormitory, new people, a completely different pace of life, it all took some getting used to. In her first semester, she even fell into a mild depression. But then she pulled herself together. "You have two choices," she told herself one evening, looking in the dorm bathroom mirror. "Either break down and go back home, or get stronger and prove that you're worth something." She chose the second path. Jamina found a part-time job as a math tutor for schoolchildren. She got more involved in university life and even signed up for Spanish language courses. In her second year, the head of the department noticed her and invited her to participate in a research project, another stepping stone in her development. Alongside her studies, Jamina began thinking about her future. She understood that renting was only a temporary solution, and owning her own place was a key part of true independence. In her third year, still tutoring, she also got a part-time job at a small auditing firm. The schedule was flexible enough to combine with her classes, and the salary, though modest, was steady. Jamina lived frugally, saving nearly half of her income toward a future apartment. After graduating, she was offered a full-time position at the same auditing firm. The work was engaging, and over time she was entrusted with increasingly complex projects. After 3 years of hard work and strict saving, Jamina had saved enough for the down payment on a small one-bedroom apartment in a residential district of the city. Her parents helped as much as they could, but the majority of the money she had earned herself. The day she received the keys to her own apartment was one of the happiest of her life. The apartment was small and needed renovations, but it was hers. Every weekend she painted, put up wallpaper, assembled furniture. Her parents came to help, but Jamina did most of the work herself or hired professionals. "This isn't just square footage," she told her friend Maria, showing her the finished renovations. "This is my personal island of safety. I earned every centimeter of it, laid every tile with my own hands." Before meeting Antonio, Jamina had a few short-lived romances. In university, she dated a classmate named Jordi, a smart but deeply insecure guy. The relationship lasted a year and a half but eventually fizzled out due to differing views on the future. Jordi wanted an early wedding and children, while Jamina was focused on establishing herself first. Next came a brief but intense romance with Victor, a photographer who had been covering a corporate event for her company. Their passionate relationship quickly turned into living together in his rented apartment. But after 3 months, Jamina realized that Victor, while creative, was utterly irresponsible. The final straw came when he spent the rent money on a new camera. That relationship taught Jamina a lot. She realized she wasn't willing to sacrifice her principles and goals, not even for love. After breaking up with Victor, she shifted her focus back to her career and setting up her new apartment. Through her student years and early career, Jamina had developed a particular style of communication. In professional settings, she carried herself modestly, preferred listening over talking, never interrupted, and always weighed her words carefully. This approach made her seem gentle and agreeable, though inside she had a firm inner core, one that could withstand any pressure. Her colleagues and supervisors respected her professionalism and reliability, but few knew the real Jamina, sharp-minded, strong-willed, and ready to defend her boundaries. Their meeting happened in the spring, just as the city was beginning to shake off its winter numbness. Jamina was coming home from work late in the evening. It had been a tough day. An audit at a major construction firm was wrapping up, the report was due in 2 days, and the number of discrepancies in the documents was higher than expected. She was walking from the metro, numbers and spreadsheets swirling in her head, when she noticed a car parked by the curb with its hood up. A man in his early 30s stood beside it, staring helplessly at the engine. Jamina would have walked right by if she hadn't recognized the car model. It was the same old Ford Focus her father, Raphael, had lovingly worked on every weekend. "Won't start?" she asked, stopping. The man turned around. He had an open, handsome face, light brown eyes, and a hint of stubble. "Yeah, it just died. No idea what's wrong." "Could be the battery," Jamina suggested. "My dad has the same car. Sometimes it pulls stunts like this." "Battery seems okay," he replied, but checked anyway. The terminals were indeed loose. "You know cars?" he asked, surprised. "Let's just say I grew up with a dad who believed a girl should know how to cook borscht and change a tire," Jamina said with a smile. The man tightened the terminals, got behind the wheel, and turned the key. The car started on the first try. "You're my savior," he said sincerely, stepping out of the car. "Antonio, by the way." "Jamina," she introduced herself. "Nice to meet you. Seriously, you really saved me. Can I at least buy you a coffee? There's a great cafe not far from here." Jamina hesitated only for a second. She liked Antonio. He gave off a sense of reliability and calm. And a cup of coffee after a long day sounded perfect. The cafe turned out to be cozy, with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. They ended up talking for nearly 2 hours. Antonio told her he worked as an engineer in a construction company, designing residential complexes. Jamina shared some stories from her audit work, though she didn't mention she was currently auditing a construction firm. What a funny coincidence, Antonio said when he found out where she worked. Our company's going through an audit too. Maybe it's fate. Jamina smiled, but made a mental note to check whether Antonio worked at the firm she was currently auditing. Would it be ethical to continue seeing him if their companies had a business relationship? The next morning, the first thing she did was check the employee list of the company under audit. Antonio wasn't there. He worked at a different construction firm. Jamina felt relieved. Their second date happened 3 days later. Antonio invited her to a small Italian restaurant. He was confident, but not arrogant. He listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and joked at just the right moments. Jamina found his company increasingly pleasant. You know, he said as he walked her home, I rarely meet women as calm and rational as you. Usually, it's all drama and outbursts, but with you, it feels steady. It was nice to hear. Jamina truly took pride in her self-control, her ability to manage emotions and not wear them on her sleeve. Though her close friends knew that beneath the surface, she could be deeply emotional and passionate. She had just learned early on to separate her inner world from outward expression. Their relationship developed gradually, without sudden leaps. Antonio was predictable, stable, and reliable, qualities that deeply appealed to Jamina after the chaos of Victor. They went to the movies, walked through parks, and sometimes took day trips out of town in his car. Antonio eagerly talked about his work, showing her the projects he was working on and explaining the technical details. Jamina listened with genuine interest. She had always loved learning new things, especially from people who were passionate about what they did. About a month after they met, a small misunderstanding arose between them for the first time. Jamina suggested going to a contemporary art exhibition, but Antonio rather sharply declined. I can't stand that smudgy stuff they call art. Let's go to the movies instead. Jamina was slightly surprised by his rigid tone. He had seemed more open-minded before, but she decided not to dwell on it. After all, everyone has their own preferences. They went to see some blockbuster and later had dinner at a restaurant, where Antonio told her that his mother was an art history professor at a cultural institute. She's an expert in classical painting, he said proudly. She used to take me to museums since I was a kid, explaining techniques, composition, lighting. I guess that's why I can't take those smears and installations seriously. That explanation reassured Jamina. Antonio simply had a particular aesthetic taste shaped by his mother, not the worst flaw. Another of Antonio's quirks started to show around 2 months into the relationship. He was reluctant to introduce Jamina to his friends. Or rather, he introduced her to some, but selectively. There were single colleagues from work whom they met from time to time, and his childhood friend Francisco with his wife Carmen. But the university friends Antonio often mentioned in conversation, she had yet to meet them. There just hasn't been the right occasion, he brushed it off when Jamina asked. Besides, they all have families and kids. I'm not into restaurant get-togethers like that. One Friday evening, they decided to watch a movie at Jamina's place. After Antonio helped her carry heavy grocery bags, they ordered pizza and opened a bottle of wine. The movie turned out to be boring, and they quickly shifted to conversation. After his second glass, Antonio suddenly asked, So, how did you manage to buy your own apartment? My parents helped. Jamina didn't like talking about money, but she answered honestly. They helped a bit, but I saved most of it myself. Started working in my 3rd year, saved up, then took out a mortgage. Wow. Antonio whistled respectfully. I still can't bring myself to take out a mortgage. I'm renting a place with a friend, cheaper that way. I hesitated for a long time too, Jamina admitted. But then I realized it's better to pay for your own place than someone else's. Antonio thoughtfully shook his head. Yeah, you're right, but taking on that kind of responsibility is scary. At that moment, Jamina felt a flicker of disappointment. Antonio was 3 years older, worked at a good company, but still lived with a roommate and was afraid of responsibility. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Maybe he had his own reasons for being cautious. Their first meeting with his friends happened 3 months into the relationship. Antonio invited her to the birthday party of his colleague Raul. The celebration took place in a restaurant with about 15 people, mostly co-workers with their partners. Jamina was nervous beforehand, but everything went smoothly. Antonio's colleagues were pleasant people. They joked a lot, asked about her audit work, and shared funny stories from the construction world. Antonio introduced her as my girlfriend Jamina, which made her happy. They hadn't officially discussed their relationship status before. After dinner, once everyone had relaxed with a few drinks, Raul, the birthday boy, suddenly said, "Antonio, where'd you find a girl like that? Smart, beautiful, and she owns her own apartment. Lock it down before she runs off." Everyone laughed, and Jamina blushed. How did Raul know about her apartment? That meant Antonio had told his friends about her and her living situation. On the way home, she asked him about it. "What's the big deal?" Antonio was genuinely surprised. "I'm proud of you for everything you've achieved on your own. It's impressive." Jamina calmed down, but a subtle discomfort lingered. For some reason, she didn't like that her apartment had become a topic of conversation among his friends. Another revealing moment happened around 6 months into the relationship. They were sitting in a park, enjoying a warm summer evening, when Antonio suddenly looked at her seriously and said, "You know, I think it's time we live together." Jamina was caught off guard. They had never discussed living arrangements before. "You're suggesting I move in with you and your roommate?" she asked with a smile. "No, of course not." Antonio laughed. "I meant I'd move in with you, to your place. It's bigger than my rented room, and the area's nicer too." Jamina paused. On the one hand, their relationship was going well, they rarely argued, and they felt comfortable together. On the other hand, she was unsettled by the fact that Antonio immediately suggested moving into her place rather than considering renting something new together, or even discussing a potential joint purchase. "Let's not rush things," she said gently. "We've only been dating for 6 months. Maybe we should get to know each other better first?" Antonio frowned slightly. "Haven't we already gotten to know each other well enough in 6 months? I think we get along great." "Yes, but living together is a different story," Jamina replied. "For example, I still haven't met your mother. I don't even know if she would approve of our relationship." Antonio's expression changed. He tensed up. "What does my mom have to do with this? It's us who are dating, not her." "But you said yourself that you're very close and consult her on many things," Jamina reminded him. Antonio paused, thinking over her words, then said, "All right, you're right. I'll introduce you. I think you two will get along, you have a lot in common." Jamina doubted that. What could a 50-year-old art historian and a 27-year-old auditor possibly have in common? But she decided not to argue. The important thing was that Antonio had agreed to the meeting. Despite his promise, Antonio seemed in no hurry to follow through. A month passed without any specific date being set. He kept coming up with excuses. His mom was busy at work, preparing for a conference, or feeling under the weather. Jamina began to suspect that Antonio was simply afraid of this introduction. "Listen, maybe you don't actually want me to meet your mom," she asked him directly one day. Antonio looked uncomfortable. "No, it's not that. It's just that my mom is very particular about the women I date. I want the first impression to be perfect." "Has she disapproved of a lot of your girlfriends?" Jamina asked with a hint of irony. Antonio hesitated. "Well, there were a few. But you're different. She'll like you, I'm sure of it. We just need to pick the right moment." That right moment came 2 weeks later when Antonio's mother herself expressed a desire to meet the woman she had heard so much about. They arranged to meet at an Italian restaurant. Antonio said his mom loved pasta. On the day of the meeting, Jamina was more nervous than usual. She spent a long time choosing what to wear and settled on a classic navy dress with simple accessories. Her makeup was subtle, and she styled her hair carefully. She wanted to make a good impression, though something in her gut told her it wouldn't be easy. Antonio met her at the metro with compliments and clearly appreciated how she looked, but Jamina noticed that he was just as nervous as she was. On the way to the restaurant, he repeated more than once. The main thing is, don't argue with her, even if you disagree. And don't mention your trip to Amsterdam. She doesn't approve of contemporary art, and especially not, well, you know, the free morals of the Netherlands. This advice made Jamina even more uneasy. Why should she hide her trip to a European city? And why should she have to conform to someone else's worldview? Juana Boros turned out to be a tall, stately woman in her 50s with perfect posture, a strict hairstyle, and piercing gray eyes, just like her son's. She wore an elegant ivory-colored suit that emphasized her slender figure and the refined pallor of her skin. "Very nice to meet you, Jamina," she said, extending her hand for a handshake. "Antonio has told me so much about you." "Likewise, Juana," Jamina replied, trying to sound calm and confident. "I've heard a lot about you as well." They sat down, ordered food and wine. The first few minutes were awkward. Antonio was nervous, Jamina was choosing her words carefully, and Juana was studying her son's girlfriend like a museum exhibit. "Antonio says you work as an auditor?" Juana finally asked. "An interesting profession for a young woman. Usually, more pragmatic personalities go into finance." "I enjoy working with numbers," Jamina answered. "Besides, auditing isn't just about money, it's also about systems, processes, people." Of course, Juana nodded. "It's just that, in my experience, women your age tend to choose more creative careers, design, psychology, teaching, something more suited to future family life." Jamina felt a flicker of irritation at Juana's condescending tone but held herself back. Everyone has their own path. "I think any profession can go hand in hand with family life as long as your priorities are clear." Of course, Juana smiled, but Jamina caught a hint of coldness in her eyes. "Antonio told me you bought an apartment on your own." "That's impressive." These days, young women usually wait for a man to provide housing. "I believe in relying on yourself first and foremost," Jamina replied, noticing Antonio tense up. "Of course, support from loved ones matters, but so do personal efforts." "What a proper stance," Juana said with a hint of irony. "A modern, independent woman. But you know, in family life, it's important to be flexible, to adapt, especially for women. Men are proud creatures, they need to feel important. Isn't that right, Antonio?" Antonio gave an awkward smile and quickly changed the subject to a recent art exhibition at the museum. His mother immediately lit up, launching into a discussion on painting techniques and historical contexts. Despite the sour aftertaste from the earlier exchange, Jamina listened with interest. She couldn't deny Juana's erudition. As the evening went on, Jamina became increasingly aware that Juana wasn't seeing her as a person, but as a potential daughter-in-law, like an item on display. Was she good enough for her son, obedient enough? Did she fit her vision of a proper woman? By the end of dinner, Jamina could physically feel the exhaustion of having to control every word and gesture. Juana seemed to notice everything: how Jamina held her fork, how she reacted to jokes, which topics sparked her interest. And each observation came with a subtle comment. "Oh, you're left-handed? How unusual." In the past, they would retrain left-handers. They thought it was wrong. "You eat so little." "Antonio likes women with an appetite. He's a real foodie, did you know?" "Your parents are teachers?" "What a noble profession, humble, but respectable. Not like today's marketers and managers." Each of these remarks felt like a tiny pinprick, not painful, but uncomfortable. By the time they said their goodbyes, Jamina was certain that Juana had formed a solid opinion of her, and it probably wasn't entirely favorable. "It was lovely meeting you, Jamina," Juana said as they stood outside the restaurant. "I hope we'll see each other again. Perhaps you'll visit our home. I have a beautiful porcelain collection I'd love to show you." Thank you for the invitation, Jamina replied sincerely. It was a pleasure to meet you too. On the way home, Antonio was unusually quiet. Only when they reached Jamina's building did he finally ask, "So, what did you think of my mom?" Jamina thought for a few seconds, choosing her words carefully. "She's an impressive woman. Very educated. Strong character. I see where you get a lot of your traits from." Antonio beamed. "I knew you two would get along. She messaged me afterward. She said she liked you. Called you a modest, well-mannered girl." Jamina gave a faint smile. She was 27, far from being a girl, and she didn't consider herself particularly modest, just good at keeping her emotions in check. When she got home, she spent a long time reflecting on the evening. Juana was clearly a dominant woman, used to controlling those around her, especially her son. She had assessed Jamina both for her strengths and her perceived flaws. But the most troubling part was how Antonio seemed to change around his mother, tense, constantly seeking her approval, almost like a little boy again. Maybe I'm exaggerating, Jamina thought as she fell asleep. After all, the first meeting is always nerve-wracking. Maybe they would get to know each other better with time, and the tension would fade. But a voice inside her whispered that it wasn't that simple, and Juana wasn't the kind of woman to easily loosen her grip on her son. After meeting Antonio's mother, Jamina began noticing how often he mentioned her in conversation. "Mom thinks," "Mom says," "Mom has a lot of experience in this," phrases that popped up constantly, about everything from choosing a restaurant to planning a vacation. "Do you always check with your mom?" Jamina asked one day, after Antonio canceled their weekend plans because of a last-minute invitation from his mother. "Not always, but often," he replied honestly. "She's very wise, she rarely gets things wrong. Plus, I'm her only son, it's important for her to feel included in my life." Jamina understood that to some extent, but the level of Juana's influence over her adult son was beginning to worry her, especially after the vacation incident, when Antonio, after already buying tickets, suddenly declared that his mother thought Cyprus was overrated and recommended Greece instead. "But we already bought the tickets," Jamina said in surprise. "And booked the hotel." "No big deal, we can change it," Antonio said casually. "Mom knows a great hotel in Crete. She went there last year with some friends. Says it's amazing." In the end, they still went to Cyprus, but Antonio was slightly tense throughout the trip, as if he felt guilty about not being able to please his mother. Upon their return, he immediately went to visit her with souvenirs and photographs, almost as though he was reporting back about their time together. These observations made Jamina question the future of their relationship. She had never planned on competing for a man's attention with his mother. The very fact that an adult, established man was so dependent on his parents' opinion unsettled her. But on the other hand, Antonio was reliable, caring, and their relationship was developing harmoniously. Perhaps, in time, he would become more independent. The proposal came unexpectedly, nearly a year after they had met. They were coming back from the cinema, discussing the film they had just watched, when Antonio suddenly stopped in the middle of the street, took Jamina's hands, and said seriously, "Jamina, I've thought about it for a long time, and I've realized that I want to be with you forever. Will you marry me?" Jamina was taken aback. They had never discussed marriage, although their relationship was going well. And now, just like that, in the middle of the street, no ring, no prior hints. "This is unexpected," she answered honestly. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Absolutely," Antonio nodded. "I've thought it through. We're perfect for each other. You're smart, calm, reliable. I feel right with you." These words touched Jamina, although the word right sounded a little strange, not happy or in love, but simply right. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "This is a serious step." Antonio frowned. "What's there to think about? We've been together for a year, everything's great. What doubts could you have?" "It's not about doubts," Jamina replied gently. "I just want to be sure that we're both ready. Marriage isn't just a stamp in a passport. You know, Antonio said suddenly, with a hint of hurt in his voice, I thought you'd be happy. Most girls dream of a proposal. This remark stung Jamina. Most girls, so she wasn't like the others? Or was Antonio just following some kind of template, not truly wanting to marry her specifically? I need time, she said firmly. A week. I promise I'll think it through carefully. Antonio reluctantly agreed, but the rest of the evening was quiet and distant. At home, Jamina spent a long time reflecting. She loved Antonio, and she felt comfortable with him. He was reliable, predictable, and caring. But there were things that made her uneasy: his dependence on his mother, his slight immaturity in everyday matters, and his lack of a place of his own at 33. Still, were these insurmountable obstacles? The next day, Jamina called her parents and told them about the proposal. Her father reacted with restraint. Are you sure, darling? Aren't you rushing into it? I'm thinking it through, Dad. Antonio is good, reliable. I feel at ease with him. At ease, that's good, Raphael said thoughtfully. But is that enough for happiness? Marriage is for life. Her mother was more optimistic. You're 27 now, Jamina. It's time to think about family. Antonio seems like a serious man. He has a good job. Of course, everyone has their flaws, but there's no such thing as perfect. The conversation with her parents didn't clarify things. Jamina called her best friend, Ira, with whom she had been friends since university. Maria listened and asked just one question. What do you really want, Jamina? To marry Antonio, or just to get married? This question made Jamina reflect on what she truly wanted and why she was feeling uncertain. After 3 days of thinking, she decided to say yes. Yes, Antonio had flaws, but who didn't? And most importantly, she felt safe, comfortable, and predictable with him. In a world full of uncertainty, these were valuable qualities. Besides, Jamina truly believed that she loved him. When she told Antonio her decision, his face lit up. He hugged her tightly and spun her around the room. I knew you'd say yes. I'm so happy. We need to tell Mom. She'll be thrilled. Mom, Jamina thought to herself. The first person he wants to share this news with is his mother, not his friends or colleagues. Maybe we should tell our parents first, she suggested. Your mom and mine? Yes, of course. Antonio quickly agreed. We'll go to your parents tomorrow, and then to mine. She already asked when we're planning to get married. This revelation surprised Jamina. She asked, and what did you say? Well, that we're thinking about it, discussing it, Antonio shrugged. She's interested in my life. That's when Jamina realized that Antonio had already discussed the possibility of their marriage with his mother, even before asking for her opinion. But she decided not to dwell on it. After all, now they were engaged, and it was time to think about the future, not focus on little details. Jamina's parents received the news with restraint, but warmth. They had already met Antonio several times and generally approved of their daughter's choice. As was tradition, her father had a serious talk with his future son-in-law about life, while her mother simply hugged Jamina and whispered, The most important thing is that you're happy, darling. However, the meeting with Juana turned out to be unexpectedly tense. Upon hearing the news, she first rejoiced, kissed her son, then hugged Jamina, but quickly moved on to practical matters. When are you planning the wedding? We need to choose a good restaurant in advance. Summer is fully booked a month ahead. And what's the format? Classic, European. How many guests? Have you already looked at dresses? I know a great atelier where my former student works. The questions came one after another, and Jamina felt how Juana was methodically taking control of the wedding planning, while Antonio just nodded and smiled, clearly used to his mother making all the decisions for him. We haven't discussed the details yet, Jamina tried to stop the flow. Maybe we should first decide on the format and date ourselves, Antonio? Of course, Juana quickly agreed, but it was clear from her eyes that she wasn't planning on staying in the background. But time flies quickly. We need to start preparations now, especially if you want a summer wedding. Why does it have to be summer? Asked Jamina. Maybe fall or spring. In summer, everyone is free, and you can organize an outdoor ceremony, Juana said confidently. Besides, Antonio has vacation in July. He always takes time off in July. Right, son? Antonio nodded without looking at Jamina, and suddenly she realized that no one had asked her when her vacation was, or if it would be convenient for her to get married in July. That evening, they had their first serious argument. Once at home, Jamina expressed everything she thought about this wedding planning strategy. I think this is our wedding, Antonio. I understand that your mom wants to help, but she's literally making all the decisions for us. Come on, you're exaggerating, Antonio waved her off. She just suggested some options. And besides, she has a lot of experience organizing events. She's always overseeing some exhibitions or conferences at the university. A wedding is not an exhibition. Jamina objected. This is our day, personal, special. And I would like us to make the decisions ourselves. We will make the decisions, Antonio said reassuringly. It's just that Mom will help with the organization. You're busy with work, you won't have time to call around to restaurants and florists. Jamina sighed. Maybe he was right, her schedule was indeed tight, and organizing a wedding was an additional burden. But still, something about the situation troubled her. All right, she finally agreed. Let her help, but the final decision will be ours, okay? And my parents should be involved in the preparations too. This is their celebration as well. Of course, Antonio hugged her. Everything will be wonderful, you'll see, we're going to have the best wedding in the world. But despite his words, the anxiety didn't leave Jamina. She started noticing more and more situations where Juana was trying to control their lives. She would call Antonio in the middle of the workday to ask if he had eaten lunch, insist on weekly visits, and advise them on how to arrange their future shared living space. You need to look for a bigger apartment, she declared one evening at dinner. A one-room apartment is for one person, but for a family, you need at least 2 rooms, especially if you plan to have children. Mom, we haven't discussed this yet, Antonio gently objected. What's there to discuss? Juana was surprised. Of course, you need a bigger apartment. You can't be cramped in a one-room place. And at your age, it's time to think about serious housing, not rented rooms. Once you get married to Jamina, you can take out a mortgage. Jamina noticed how Antonio tensed up at the word mortgage. He still avoided conversations about buying their own home, even though he earned well and could easily afford a mortgage. Jamina has a nice apartment, he said. We'll live there for now, and we'll see what happens later. In a one-room? Juana asked skeptically. It's cramped for a couple. No, you need to think about the future. Maybe you could sell Jamina's apartment and add some money to buy a 2-bedroom or even a 3-bedroom place for the future kids. Jamina physically felt her cheeks flush. Juana, without asking her opinion, casually suggested selling her apartment, the very one she had saved for years, into which she had put so much effort and heart. I'm not planning to sell my apartment, she said firmly. It's my own home. I've worked hard for it. But for the family, sometimes sacrifices need to be made, Juana said lightly reproachfully. The common good is above personal interests. Isn't that right? Jamina felt irritation building inside her but restrained herself, only gripping her fork tighter. In our case, I think there are other solutions. For example, Antonio could sell his car and add the money for the down payment. The car? Juana asked, genuinely surprised. But a man needs a car for work, for mobility. A house is just walls. For me, it's not just walls, Jamina retorted. It's my home, my fortress. I've invested not only money but also my soul into it. The atmosphere at the table became tense. Antonio helplessly shifted his gaze between his mother and his fiancée, clearly unsure of which side to take. All right, Juana said in a conciliatory tone. I just suggested an option. Of course, it's up to you to decide. But from her tone, Jamina understood that the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. And she was right. The next day, Antonio brought up the possibility of selling the apartment and buying a bigger place. Mom's right, he said. For a family, a one-room apartment is too small, especially if we're going to have kids. But we're not even married yet, Jamina objected. And we're not planning on having children right now. Why rush? Not rushing, but planning for the future, Antonio corrected her. There's a difference. Jamina realized that this conversation was a direct result of Juana's influence. And while she didn't want to argue with her future mother-in-law, she wasn't about to give in on such an important issue either. Let's get married first, live together for a couple of years, and then we'll figure out the housing situation, she suggested as a compromise. Maybe by then your career will take off, and we'll be able to buy a bigger apartment without selling mine. Antonio reluctantly agreed, but Jamina could see that this issue would come up again and again, with the main initiator not being her husband, but her mother-in-law. Despite these tensions, the wedding preparations were in full swing. Juana, as promised, took care of most of the organizational details. She booked a restaurant, found the host, and arranged for a photographer. Jamina focused on choosing the dress and organizing the ceremony, involving her mother in the process. Sylvia, always sensitive to her daughter's mood, once asked, "Jamina, are you sure this is what you want? You look a little tense." "I'm just tired, Mom," Jamina waved it off. "Work is crazy, and now all this wedding preparation." "It's not just that," her mother shook her head. "I can see something's bothering you." Jamina sighed. Her mom always saw right through her. "Juana. She's too actively involved in our lives. Sometimes I feel like Antonio listens to her more than to me." "That's a common problem," Sylvia nodded. "Especially with only sons. It's hard for mothers to let go, and sons get used to the care. But over time, everything will settle down. The key is to set boundaries from the start." "I'm trying," Jamina admitted. "But it's not easy." "Of course, it's not easy," her mother agreed. "But you're a strong girl, you'll manage. And remember, this is your life, your family, your decisions." These words of support gave Jamina confidence. She decided to be more assertive about her opinions on matters regarding her and Antonio's future, and not let Juana dictate the terms. And yet, despite all these difficulties, Jamina truly loved Antonio and believed their marriage would be happy. Yes, he had flaws, but who doesn't? The important thing was that he was kind, caring, and reliable. With such a person, a future could be built. The wedding took place in mid-July at a countryside restaurant with beautiful grounds. The day was sunny and warm. Everything was going according to plan. Jamina looked radiant in an elegant white dress, and Antonio was handsome in a dark blue suit. The ceremony was touching, with vows they had written themselves. Antonio spoke about reliability, care, and respect. Jamina spoke about support, understanding, and loyalty. When they exchanged rings, both sets of parents couldn't hold back tears. The reception was excellently organized, largely thanks to Juana. She controlled every detail, from the seating arrangement to the sequence of the dishes. The guests, about 50 people, including relatives, friends, and colleagues, were pleased. The only unpleasant moment was Juana's speech. Raising her glass to the newlyweds, she said, "My dear children, I am so happy that Antonio found such a wonderful girl. Jamina, I know you will be a great wife to my son. I want to give you a piece of advice for the future. Family is first and foremost about compromises. Sometimes you need to know how to give in to each other, and sometimes even to the parents." She smiled meaningfully. "After all, we, the older generation, have lived a lot and understand a thing or two about life. Remember that, and your marriage will be strong." Jamina smiled tightly, realizing that this advice was aimed primarily at her. Antonio, however, nodded gratefully, clearly unaware of the hidden subtext. After the wedding, the newlyweds went on their honeymoon, a week-long tour of Italy. They planned this trip on their own, without Juana's involvement. And for the first time, Jamina felt like they were truly a family, just the two of them, without outside influence. Rome, Florence, Venice, each city charmed them with its unique atmosphere. They walked along narrow streets, enjoyed the local cuisine, and made plans for the future. Antonio was affectionate and attentive, interested in her opinions, and didn't talk about his mother. This week seemed perfect to Jamina, reaffirming that her choice had been the right one. "You know," Antonio said on the last evening, as they sat in a small restaurant on the banks of the Grand Canal in Venice, "I'm so happy we're together. You're exactly the wife I dreamed of." "The one you dreamed of?" Jamina asked with a smile, sipping her chilled white wine. "Calm, sensible, reliable," he replied without hesitation. "You don't cause scenes, you don't demand constant attention. It's comfortable with you." Jamina smiled, though deep down she wanted to hear different words, not comfortable, but exciting, not calm, but beloved. But she pushed those thoughts away. After all, wasn't stability and comfort the foundation of a strong marriage? Upon returning to the capital, the routine of family life began. Antonio moved into Jamina's apartment, bringing with him the bare minimum of belongings, clothes, books, and his computer. They decided not to take his furniture since Jamina's apartment was already fully furnished. The first few weeks of living together were filled with pleasant tasks. They were arranging their shared space, getting used to each other's habits, and enjoying their new status as husband and wife. Jamina discovered that Antonio was neat, didn't leave things scattered around, and knew how to cook a few simple dishes. He found out that Jamina was a night owl, liked to read before bed, and couldn't stand when anyone touched her work papers. "Is everything always this perfectly clean with you?" Antonio once asked, watching his wife dust the shelves in the closet. "Not perfectly, but I like order," Jamina replied. "Especially with work documents." "I hope it doesn't bother you?" "No, of course not," Antonio smiled. "I even like it. My mom always said that neatness is a sign of a disciplined mind." The phrase "mom always said" began appearing more and more often in their conversations as the honeymoon euphoria wore off. At first, Jamina didn't think much of it. It was normal for someone to reference parental advice. But gradually, she began to notice that Juana's opinion seemed more important to Antonio than hers. For example, Jamina suggested painting the bedroom walls from beige to light blue. Antonio initially agreed, but the next day he said, "You know, I talked to Mom. She thinks blue isn't suitable for the bedroom. It's a cold color and might affect the quality of sleep. Better to stick with beige or choose a warm green." "Since when is your mom an expert on interior design?" Jamina couldn't help but add a touch of sarcasm. "She's not an expert, but she has good taste," Antonio said, slightly offended. "And besides, she's an art historian, she understands color combinations." In the end, the walls stayed beige, and for the first time, Jamina felt that their family was not just the two of them, but a third person, someone who had the final say. Then came other suggestions from Juana: what curtains to hang, what appliances to buy, even which laundry detergent to use. And every time, Antonio insisted on following his mother's advice. "We can't discuss every household matter with her," Jamina finally snapped after Antonio had called his mother for the third time in a week to ask for advice on choosing a stove. "Why not?" Antonio asked, genuinely surprised. "Mom knows a lot about household appliances. She has a lot of experience." "Because this is our family, and these are our decisions," Jamina patiently explained. "We need to learn to make them on our own." Antonio looked puzzled. "But what's wrong with asking advice from someone more experienced?" "There's nothing wrong if it's an occasional thing. But when every decision has to be approved by your mom, it's too much." Antonio pouted like a child. "You just don't like my mom. You're always picking on her." "I'm not picking on her," Jamina replied tiredly. I just want us to build our family ourselves without constant outside influence. This conversation didn't lead to any changes. Antonio continued to consult his mother about everything, and Juana, in turn, didn't hesitate to give unsolicited advice. The first real test for the young couple came with finances. Before their marriage, Jamina and Antonio hadn't discussed how they would handle their budget. It was assumed that each would contribute their share to common expenses while maintaining financial independence. But a month into their married life, Antonio suggested combining their accounts. It'll be more convenient. All the money in one place, clear and transparent. I'm not sure, Jamina replied cautiously. I think we each need our own funds, without needing to justify them. Don't you trust me? Antonio immediately became defensive. Do you think I'm going to waste your money? It's not about trust, Jamina countered. It's just that I'm used to financial independence, and besides, I have a mortgage, a car loan. Those are my personal obligations. Aren't they now our common ones? Antonio asked, genuinely surprised. We're family now. This argument sounded convincing, and Jamina almost agreed, but something held her back. Maybe it was the unsettling feeling that Antonio, despite earning a good salary, still lived in a rented apartment with a roommate, unwilling to commit to owning his own place. Or that in the 3 months they'd been living together, he had never suggested splitting expenses equally. Jamina was paying for the apartment, utilities, groceries, while his contributions were limited to occasional purchases and dinners at restaurants. Let's leave things as they are for now, she proposed as a compromise. We'll open a joint account for everyday expenses, where each of us will contribute a fixed amount, and the rest of the money will stay in our personal accounts. Antonio reluctantly agreed, but Jamina could see that he wasn't happy. A couple of days later, it turned out he had discussed the issue with his mother. Mom thinks there shouldn't be a separate budget in a family, Antonio declared. It creates distrust and division. Does Mom know that you don't have a mortgage or big debts? Jamina asked reasonably. That I'm covering most of the common expenses for now? What does that have to do with it? Antonio responded indignantly. In a family, does it matter how much each person contributes? Today you contribute more, tomorrow I will. The important thing is trust. Exactly, Jamina nodded. Trust should be mutual. I trust you, but you also need to trust me when it comes to managing my finances. After this conversation, Antonio sulked for a few days, becoming distant, even rude. But then, he suddenly became overly polite. He bought flowers, cooked dinner, did some small repairs in the bathroom. Jamina was touched by this attention and thought that he had reconsidered the situation and accepted her point of view. But a week later, Antonio brought up the financial issue again, this time proposing a new scheme. Let's do this. I'll pay for our food, entertainment, and travel, and you'll pay for the apartment and utilities. It'll be more convenient for you that way. Jamina thought for a moment. The offer seemed reasonable, if not for one detail. Her monthly payments for the mortgage, utilities, and parking amounted to about 4,000 euros, while they spent a maximum of 2,000 euros on food and entertainment. That's not very fair, she pointed out. My expenses will be almost twice as much as yours. But this is your apartment, Antonio said, surprised. You would pay the mortgage anyway, even if you were living alone. This argument hit a nerve with Jamina. It seemed that Antonio didn't consider himself a full participant in creating their home together, but more of a guest who paid a moderate fee for staying there. Anyway, this is our shared home now, she said firmly. And the expenses should be fairly divided, either equally or proportionally to our incomes. But this isn't my home, Antonio countered. My name is only on the documents. If we get divorced, I'll be left with nothing. These words came like a thunderclap. They had been married for only 3 months, and Antonio was already talking about a possible divorce and worrying about the division of property. I don't understand, Jamina said slowly, feeling anxiety rising within her. Did you marry me, or my apartment? What nonsense is that? Antonio flared up. I'm just talking about fairness. Why should I invest in your property? Because we are family, Jamina responded, using his own recent argument. In a family, do we count who contributed what? Antonio didn't know how to answer and simply went to the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. From that day on, the financial issue became a constant source of tension in their relationship. They never reached a final decision. Jamina continued to pay for the apartment and utilities, while Antonio occasionally brought groceries and paid restaurant bills. They no longer discussed joint planning for major purchases or savings. Another bone of contention was the visits from Juana. During the first month after the wedding, she kept a respectful distance, calling her son only occasionally. But gradually her presence in their lives became more pronounced. First, she started coming over once a week just for tea. Then her visits increased to 2 or 3 times a week, and she would come without warning at any time of day. I think we should set some boundaries for when your mom visits, Jamina cautiously suggested after her mother-in-law caught her in a bathrobe, fresh out of the shower. After all, this is our personal space. What do you mean, set boundaries? Antonio frowned. She's my mother. She can come whenever she wants. But we don't live in her house, Jamina replied. This is our apartment, and it's normal if we know in advance when visitors are coming. Any visitors, not just your mom. I see, Antonio drawled with an unpleasant smirk. This is your apartment, and you set the rules. Just a reminder, I live here too. That's not what I meant, Jamina said wearily. It's just basic etiquette to notify us in advance before a visit. I'll talk to her, Antonio reluctantly agreed. But it seemed that conversation never took place. Juana continued to show up unannounced, sometimes catching Jamina at the most inconvenient times, working with confidential documents, during online meetings, or even in bed when she was feeling sick and had taken a sick day. With each visit, her mother-in-law became more and more intrusive in their home, rearranging things, giving cleaning tips, criticizing food choices and cooking methods. One day, Jamina discovered that Juana had rewashed all the dishes in the cupboard because she thought they weren't clean enough. Thanks, but you didn't have to go through all that trouble, Jamina said, holding herself back. I take care of the cleanliness in the house myself. I'm sure, dear, Juana replied with a light smile. I just wanted to help. You have such a stressful job, you don't always have time for thorough cleaning. These words, spoken with feigned concern, were actually a thinly veiled insult, and Jamina understood that perfectly. But she didn't start a fight. She simply said firmly, next time, please ask before you change anything in our home. Of course, Juana agreed obediently, but her eyes showed she wasn't planning to follow this request. When Jamina told Antonio about the incident, he just shrugged. Mom meant well. She's used to taking care of me, the house. Don't take it so personally. It's not about care, it's about respecting boundaries, Jamina countered. I would never wash the dishes in someone else's house without asking first, not even at your mom's. But this isn't a foreign home for her, Antonio said. It's her son's home. Again, Jamina felt that her apartment wasn't their home, but her home, where Antonio was just living. This duality in his attitude, sometimes ours, sometimes yours, irritated and unsettled her. This continued for 3 months of their life together. Jamina became increasingly tired of her mother-in-law's constant visits, the need to defend her boundaries, and the ongoing financial disputes with her husband. She felt that their relationship, which had been so harmonious before marriage, was gradually deteriorating. Antonio became irritable, often snapping at small things, could spend hours playing video games, ignoring her presence. And Juana increasingly hinted that Jamina should pay more attention to the house and her husband, even if it meant reducing her working hours. In a woman's life, career is not the most important thing, she would say, sipping coffee in Jamina's kitchen. What matters is family, comfort, and harmony in the home. Men are built this way. They need to come home to a hot dinner and a good mood, not papers and a laptop. Jamina didn't argue, though inside she was boiling with indignation. She worked as hard as Antonio, but still managed to keep the house in order, cook, and even lift her husband's spirits. But he never asked her how her day went, never offered to help with the housework, and showed no interest in her professional concerns. The inner discomfort grew, and Jamina decided it was time to have a frank conversation with Antonio. Choosing an evening when they were both free and relatively calm, she suggested discussing how their life together was going. "I feel like we're drifting apart," she cautiously began. "You're often irritated, you don't talk to me much. I want to understand what the problem is." Antonio sighed. "There's no problem. It's just a tough time at work, a new project, a lot of responsibility." "I understand, but we could be supporting each other," Jamina said. "Instead, we only argue about money, about your mom's visits, about which stove to buy." "Exactly," Antonio suddenly became more animated. "Constant complaints, endless dissatisfaction. Mom's right, modern women are too focused on themselves, their rights, their independence. But family is about compromises, about learning to give in. Both of us should give in," Jamina noted. "Not just me." "And what? I don't give in?" Antonio asked, genuinely surprised. "I moved into your apartment, even though I could have insisted that we rent a bigger place. I don't demand that you cook every day, even though I could. I'm actually meeting you halfway in many things." This answer stunned Jamina. It seemed that Antonio saw ordinary, reasonable behavior of an adult man in a family as a huge concession, almost a sacrifice on his part. "I think we have different views on family life," she said slowly. "I see a family as a partnership of equals, where both contribute to the household, the budget, and emotional support. But you, it seems, think that there are male and female roles. And if you stoop to doing women's work, that's already a huge favor. Isn't that the case?" Antonio asked, genuinely surprised. "Of course, there are male and female duties. It's always been that way. You don't ask me to do the repairs, do you? That's my job. So why can't I expect you to take care of the house? It's a normal division of labor. But we both work full-time." Jamina protested. "What do gender roles have to do with it? If both of us are equally busy outside the home, then household duties should be split equally." Now I get where these complaints are coming from," Antonio smirked. "You've been reading your feminist articles. Mom said you have too modern views on family. What does your mom have to do with this?" Jamina couldn't take it anymore. "We're talking about our relationship now, about what's happening between us. And Mom is part of our family, whether you like it or not," Antonio cut her off. "And her opinion matters to me. She's a wise woman, lived a long life, raised me alone after my father died. She knows what a real family is and what women's duties are." Jamina realized that this conversation was pointless. Antonio was completely under the influence of his mother, took her words as the ultimate truth, and it was impossible to convince him otherwise. After this conversation, their relationship became even more strained. Antonio stayed later and later at work, and on weekends, he went to his mother's, leaving Jamina alone. She, in turn, immersed herself in her work, trying to be away from home, where the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. Juana, sensing the vulnerability in their marriage, became more active. She called Antonio several times a day, invited him to lunches on weekdays, insisted on family dinners on weekends. And more, her conversations with Jamina included phrases like, "Antonio is so sensitive. He needs special care. Men are like children, they need attention and admiration. Modern women ask too much of their husbands, they just need to create comfort and not burden them with problems." Jamina tried to ignore these comments, but every day it became harder to keep her composure. She felt trapped. On one hand, she genuinely wanted to save the marriage, but on the other, she realized that the situation was becoming unbearable. The turning point came when Jamina, coming home earlier than usual due to a canceled meeting, found Juana in her apartment. Her mother-in-law was calmly sitting in the living room, sorting through documents that had been stored in Jamina's personal cabinet. "What are you doing?" Jamina asked in shock, seeing her personal papers, bank statements, contracts, receipts, spread all over the table. "Oh, Jamina, you're already home?" Juana replied without the slightest hint of embarrassment. "I was just helping to organize the documents. You've got such a mess here. Important papers should be kept in an orderly fashion." "These are my personal documents," Jamina said, barely holding back her anger. "And they were organized the way it's convenient for me. I didn't ask you to organize them." "There's no need to get so worked up, dear," Juana smiled soothingly. "I just wanted to help. By the way, I see you have quite a sum in your account. Have you and Antonio thought about investing it in renovation? The wallpaper in the bedroom is already looking a little old." That was too much. Not only had Juana invaded her personal space, but she had also examined her financial documents, and now she was suggesting how to spend her money. "Please, put everything back the way it was and leave," Jamina demanded. Juana had no choice but to comply. After the incident with the documents, the relationship between Jamina and Juana completely soured. Juana pretended that nothing significant had happened, while Jamina tried to avoid her as much as possible. As usual, Antonio sided with his mother, claiming that she had only wanted to help and that Jamina was overreacting to trivial matters. At the office, Jamina immersed herself in a major project, an audit of an international company. The task was complex but interesting, requiring her full concentration and many overtime hours. This helped her avoid thinking about the problems at home, although it also deepened the emotional distance from her husband. On the day that Jamina would later call the day of revelation, she finished work earlier than usual. A meeting with a client had been unexpectedly canceled, and her boss let her go home, commenting that she had been working too much lately. "Take a break, Jamina," Raul said as he reviewed her report. "You've been staying late for 3 weeks in a row. I bet your husband misses you." Jamina gave a weak smile, thinking that her husband probably hadn't even noticed her absence. Recently, they hardly spoke at all. Antonio was either at his mother's or sitting at the computer, wearing headphones and playing some shooting game. On her way home, she decided to buy groceries for dinner, maybe even a bottle of wine. "I should try to improve our relationship," thought Jamina as she picked out fresh vegetables at the supermarket. "After all, we've only been married for 3 months. We should be able to find common ground." But deep down, she doubted it was possible. Their views on family, on role distribution, and on personal boundaries were just too different. And Juana's influence on her son was too strong. With bags of groceries in hand, Jamina made her way up to her floor and was about to open the door when she heard voices coming from the apartment. Antonio should have been at work. He never came home so early. Could it be my mother-in-law again? Jamina thought with irritation as she inserted the key into the lock. But what she saw when she opened the door exceeded all her worst expectations. Coming home that evening from work, Jamina saw her husband and mother-in-law showing her pre-marriage apartment to a potential buyer. They thought Jamina was completely naive, but little did they know she could give them a piece of her mind. In the living room, where she used to love spending her evenings reading a book, Antonio, Juana, and a middle-aged man in an expensive suit were standing. They were looking at the room, and Antonio was enthusiastically describing the south-facing side. "And the windows face the yard. It's very quiet. The neighbors are intellectuals," he was saying. "The renovation was done just 2 years ago. Everything is high quality, expensive." "Is the kitchen large?" the man asked, looking around with obvious interest. "I love cooking. That's important to me." 12 square meters, Juana answered readily. "Very convenient layout. We even installed a dishwasher. If you like, we can show it to you. Spacious, modern." "Yes, I'd like to see that," the man nodded. "And the bathroom too. What price have you set for the apartment?" "We're asking for 150,000 euros, Antonio replied confidently. "It's a bit below market value, but we're interested in a quick sale. We've found a great 3-bedroom apartment nearby." Jamina froze in the doorway, unable to believe her ears or eyes. They weren't just showing her apartment to a stranger, they had already set a price and were planning to sell it. Her apartment, without her knowledge or consent. "We installed." We're asking, the words echoed in her ears. She didn't even remember when she dropped the grocery bags, but the sound of them hitting the floor caught the attention of all three of them. Jamina? Antonio turned to the door in surprise. You're already home? I see what you're doing, Jamina said in an icy tone, feeling an overwhelming wave of fury rising inside her, unlike anything she had ever felt before. And I see what you're doing too. Jamina, don't worry, Juana quickly interjected. We're just showing the apartment to Augustin. He showed interest in our listing. An ad? Jamina asked, taking a step forward and slamming the door behind her. You posted an ad about selling my apartment? Our apartment, Antonio corrected. After all, we're family. Family? Jamina bitterly chuckled. Family is when decisions are made together, not behind each other's backs. What have you done here? My dear, Juana interjected with that special condescending tone Jamina hated so much. There's no need to get so upset. Antonio and I have thought it all through. There's a great 3-bedroom apartment in our area. Your apartment plus a small additional payment would be just enough. It's for your future, for the kids. For our future? Jamina looked at her husband, who appeared more and more unsure. Antonio, are you serious? You decided to sell my apartment behind my back? Listen, maybe we shouldn't make a scene in front of a stranger. Antonio tried to reason with her, nodding toward the buyer, who clearly felt uncomfortable. I'm not making a scene. Jamina snapped. You're the ones holding a property showing without the owner's consent. Have you lost your minds? Jamina! Antonio exclaimed. Watch your language. My mother is here. And this is my apartment. Jamina nearly shouted, feeling something snap inside her. My apartment, do you understand? I paid for it, I renovated it. I'm still paying off the mortgage. And no one, hear me, no one has the right to decide its fate except me. Jamina, don't panic. Antonio stepped toward her, but she backed away. My mom and I have thought it all through. It's a great idea. A bigger apartment, a good neighborhood, close to a school and a kindergarten. With your mom, Jamina repeated in echo. And suddenly, everything fell into place. All those months of discomfort, all the arguments, it all came down to one thing: her husband had never grown up. He was completely dependent on his mother, letting her make decisions for him, for both of them. Do you ever make any decisions on your own, without your mom? What does that have to do with anything? Antonio flared up. Mom has more experience than us. She knows better. What does she know better? Jamina interrupted. How to live in my apartment. How to manage my money. How to run my family. Our family, Antonio corrected again. And yes, she knows better how to build a family. She has a lot of experience. You've got an impressive family experience, Juana. Jamina turned to her mother-in-law, feeling something hot and uncontrollable rising inside her. Raising a son who, at 33, can't make decisions on his own, doesn't own his own home, and lets his mother control his family, now that takes skill. How dare you? Juana gasped in outrage. Antonio, do you hear what she's saying? This is unacceptable. Jamina, you're going too far. Antonio took a step toward his wife, his face contorted with anger. Apologize to my mom, immediately. Apologize? Jamina felt tears of anger and hurt running down her cheeks. For what? For telling the truth? You came into my home, showing it to a stranger, planning to sell it without my consent, and I should apologize. I thought you were a reasonable woman, Antonio sneered. But you're throwing a tantrum over nothing. Over nothing? Jamina took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. You know what, Antonio? I am a reasonable woman, and that's why I'm asking all of you to leave my apartment, right now. What? Antonio stood there in shock. You're kicking me out? Yes, Jamina said firmly. You, your mother, and you, she nodded toward the buyer, who was already quietly heading for the exit. Of the three of you, only this person is blameless. He just found himself in an unpleasant situation. I'm sorry, I think I'll leave now, the buyer mumbled, hurrying toward the door. Looks like the apartment isn't quite ready for sale. Not ready, and it never will be. Jamina cut him off. The apartment is not for sale, and it will never be sold. The buyer hurried out the door, and the room was filled with a heavy silence. Juana looked at her daughter-in-law with undisguised hatred. Antonio kept switching his bewildered gaze between his wife and his mother. Jamina, are you serious? Finally, he blurted out. We're husband and wife. We were, Jamina replied calmly, feeling a strange sense of relief, as though a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But I can't be the wife of a man who doesn't respect my opinion, my boundaries, my property. And even more so, I can't live in a family where the decisions are made not by the husband, but by the mother-in-law. Jamina, Antonio's voice became pleading, let's talk about this calmly. Yeah, we rushed with the showing, but the idea is good. A 3-bedroom apartment, think about it. There's nothing to discuss, Jamina cut him off, feeling adrenaline pulsing in her temples. You posted an ad to sell my apartment behind my back, set a price, and brought a buyer. Did you think I was so stupid that I'd agree to all this? No one thinks you're stupid, Juana tried to soften the situation, although her eyes told a different story. You're just a little stubborn when it comes to your independence. We wanted to show you a ready option so you could see all the benefits. Stubborn? Jamina felt something snap inside her. Years of holding back emotions, trying to be good and reasonable suddenly turned into rage. This isn't stubbornness, it's my right to live my life the way I want. And you know what? Not only can I refuse, I can also slap the one who invades my life without asking. With these words, she decisively opened the drawer of the dresser, took out the spare keys, and handed them to Antonio. Here, take your stuff and get out of my apartment today. And take your mother with you. How dare you? Juana screamed, jumping up from the sofa. Antonio, she can't treat us like this. This is unacceptable. Oh, I can, Jamina answered calmly, feeling a strange clarity in her thoughts. And I will. This is my apartment, and I decide who lives here. Get out. Both of you. Jamina, you don't understand what you're doing. Antonio tried to grab her hand, but she pulled it away. We're family. We can work this out. No, Antonio, it's you who doesn't understand, her voice was steely. Family is about respect, trust, and honesty. We have none of that. What we have is you, your mother, and me, an outsider in your little scheme. So take your things and leave. You'll regret this, Antonio hissed, finally showing his true face. You think you're so clever? You wouldn't be anything without me. I know exactly what I'm worth, Jamina replied, surprised at her own calmness. But you should think about it. Who are you without your mom, who decides everything for you? Juana grabbed her bag and, throwing Jamina a scorching look, headed for the door. Let's go, Antonio, we don't belong here. Let her sit in her little hole alone. Better alone than with you, Jamina retorted, closing the door behind them. The resolution of the conflict over the next few days felt like a haze. Antonio took his things when Jamina wasn't home, leaving the keys in the mailbox. No note, no call, just the lonely keys, symbolizing the end of their marriage. Jamina took some time off work to sort out her thoughts and paperwork. She consulted a lawyer about divorce, changed the locks in her apartment, and gradually erased every trace of Antonio from her life. There were also attempts at reconciliation, but not from Antonio, only from his mother. Juana called mutual friends, trying to influence Jamina, even coming once with an apology, but Jamina remained firm. You know, Juana, she said, standing in the doorway and not letting her mother-in-law into the apartment, I'm grateful to you. Grateful? Juana was surprised. Yes, you opened my eyes. I thought I married a grown man, but it turned out I married a mama's boy. It's better to know this now than in 10 years, when there are kids involved. The divorce went quickly and without drama. They had no joint property, children, or significant shared debts. Antonio didn't contest the apartment, understanding the absurdity of such claims. It all ended with 2 court sessions and signing a few papers. A new life. A year passed. Jamina sat in a cozy cafe with her friend Maria, talking about her new project at work. "How's your personal life?" Maria asked. "You still haven't told me what happened with that architect who invited you to the exhibition." "Pedro?" Jamina smiled. "We're just friends for now, I'm not rushing." "And you didn't sell your apartment?" "No, and I'm not planning to," Jamina answered firmly. "This is my home, my fortress. I've renovated it, bought new furniture. I feel good there." "And Antonio? Have you heard anything about him?" "They say he got married again," Jamina shrugged. "To a girl about 20 years old. They're living with his mom." "Poor guy," Maria shook her head. "Who? Antonio?" Jamina chuckled. "No, his new wife. But, really, that's no longer your problem." "Exactly," Jamina agreed, lifting her coffee cup. "And you know, I've never once regretted my decision. Sometimes, you just need to be able to say no and stand your ground, even if it means showing that you can do more than just sit quietly in the corner. You can also give a slap when it's necessary." They both laughed, and Jamina thought to herself that life had truly improved. Maybe not in the way she had planned a year ago, but definitely for the better. She was free, independent, and, finally, belonged only to herself.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.